one comment about the temporary nature of my setup now. I really want to apologize. We have company, my brother's in from California to help me with the construction on the master bedroom. And so we've got a lot of things that are going on in the house, and he's occupying the room I used to broadcast in. So I have to set up on sawhorses a tabletop that's really unsteady. And already wasn't all that happy with the previous one. I've had people say, that when I get excited and start pounding on my desk, it makes everything jiggle. And that's already, bad enough, but now it's 100 times worse. So I'll do the best I can, to compose myself, try to be more measured, maybe. But I'm afraid that each time I even just put my elbow down, it's going to make a mess. So we'll do the best we can. You'll be patient with me, and we'll get through all of this, I'm sure. Yeah, we're going to take a second night for chapter 6. It just can't be overstated, I think, how important that chapter is. It very surely sets the tone for the entirety of the rest of the book. It is the reason, really, for the existence of the book. It gives us an overview of the predictive prophecies that are presented within the book. And so the 6th chapter is well worthy of 2 nights tonight. Let's start, though, with a brief review of what we've seen already in the preceding 5 chapters. So we've had a number of things that are said in the preface as a setup for what will transpire. This is, in verse 1 of chapter 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ. We'll stop. It is then an unveiling. It is an uncovering. It is going to expose aspects of Christ and his work and activities that you would not have otherwise. But it's especially intended to be understood. And this is a revelation which God gave him to show to his bondservants the things which must shortly take place, according to verse 2. And then in verse 3, at the very end, because the time is near. So the great majority of the book must be fulfilled soon, shortly, near to the time that it was written. Now, I think it's an unfortunate myth that it has been written in the 90s. It's too bad that took prevalent belief and had so many fans. It's incorrect. I think there's no doubt that it's incorrect. But even so, if you take the late date, 30 years later than when I'm sure it was actually written, what happened shortly, near? What came to pass quickly? Now to read 5 times in the last few verses of the last chapter. The primary emphasis is on things that are close. Whenever the book was written, you should be looking for things to come to pass soon. That is stated. Then we have, of course, the information in verse 7 tied directly to Matthew chapter 24. It is a quote from verse 30. Behold, he's coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn over him. Even so, amen. 4 verses later in Matthew 24, Jesus said all these things must take place in this generation. Well, it's apparent to me that if you're going to start this book 35 years later, after Jesus said this generation would see it on Mount Olivet, 35 years later, here's this book telling us it's shortly to take place. Time is near. Well, it's the end of that generation. It's quite near. It has been a generation, 35 years. It is upon these people now. And then John, the brother and fellow partaker in the tribulation. That tribulation figures highly in Matthew 24, for instance. It's been ongoing for some time. It's reaching a crescendo now as this book is being written. This event, this judgment, this coming, those tribes of the earth mourning, is something that took place soon after the 90s, if that's what you think. Nobody's really been able to identify anything. So there's this disconnect. But if the book's written in the 60s, then the fall of Jerusalem follows just a couple of few years later. It's very obviously a perfect fit. Then we have Jesus in a revelation of himself, who is in the middle of lampstands, clothed in a robe reaching to his feet, girded about his breast with a golden girdle, head and hair like white, eyes flame of fire. I can't reread it all, But in verse 19, he says, write therefore the things which you have seen. So we will find some things in the book that he's already seen and he's going to write and tell about. The things which are, some things will be taking place in the present tense, or current events, and those which will take place after these things, though, except for one brief passage much later in our studies, which makes it abundantly plain that it is an exception, the majority of the book is shortly to come to pass. It'll come to pass after these things, but not centuries and millenniums later. We're familiar with chapters 2 and 3 and the whole list of predictive prophecies that would come to pass shortly and in the real world, historical events that we looked at last week with regard to Ephesus and Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Which brings us to chapter 4 and verse 1. After these things I looked, behold, a door open in heaven, and the first voice which I had heard, like of a trumpet speaking with me, the voice of Jesus, said, come up here, and I will show you what must take place after these things. So after what's predicted in 2 and 3, real time and space events, soon to come to pass, now we're going to see these things that will follow directly on the heels of them. So not far off at all. There's a little bit of time. There's a couple of years going on here. It's the end of the generation, though. And so then, of course, we have in chapters 4 and 5 this magnificent throne room scene. It's so hard for me. I reread it in preparation for this class, and I just want to read the whole thing over again. It's so magnificent. So here is this one, like a jasper stone and a sardius and a rainbow around the throne, like an emerald. Let me just kind of give a shout out. I'm careful not to reveal anybody's names. I think it's probably best, that I conceal that data. But got a letter this week about this sardius, for instance. Thank you for your participation. It was really a great comment and a sidelight that I'd never seen before. It was helpful in my understanding of the book. So thank you all for just being such dedicated and involved students. I got a letter I read today about a man who's already read Art Ogden's commentary more than once during the time that he's been studying with me here through these lessons. And so he's spending hours and hours and hours in addition to this single hour or 90 minutes that we spend on Monday nights. Those kinds of students are just, thrilling and speak so well of Christ's influence in your life. So I wish I could go on, and get into everything. We're just skipping so much, but I'm hoping you are waking up and getting excited about how much is in this book. I'm not sure I'm going to cover 50% of the things that I've observed, many of which I think are just profoundly important. But I'd spend the rest of my life doing it. We just can't take the time. So there's these elders on 24 thrones, and we've got these 7 lamps of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God, the sea of glass like crystal, and then the 4 living creatures, and then all the praise that they're offering in verse 8. Holy, holy is the Lord God. And 3 times actually, the Almighty, who was and who is to come. And more praise in verse 11. And then this very unhappy scene at the start of chapter 5. In the right hand of him who sat on the throne, a book written inside and on the back. That is a scroll. Well, there must be a sizable amount of material that's written on that scroll. But there are 7 seals locking it up. So I saw a strong angel proclaiming, loud voice, who's worthy to open the book and to break its seals? And no one, not in heaven, not on the earth, not under the earth, is able to open the book. In other words, they're not qualified. They're not worthy, we find out in a minute or two here. John's so upset about it, he weeps and weeps greatly that no one was found worthy to open the book or to look into it. So let's remember that today. I didn't focus on it at all last week. There's the seals. There's the ability to open the book only after the 7 seals have been broken. And then there's the book. It's the book that's the important thing. So stop weeping. Verse 5, the Lion from the tribe of Judah, root of David, is overcome. That's what qualifies him. That's why he's worthy to open the book and its 7 seals. I saw between the throne with the 4 living creatures and the elders a lamb standing as if slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. And he takes the book. And this eruption of praise and thanksgiving and mostly glorying in who God and Christ are and worshiping and praising them takes place. The new song in verses 9 and 10. Loud voice, worthy is the Lamb in verse 12. And verse 13, to him who sits on the throne and the Lamb, blessing and honor and glory, dominion forever and ever. It's such a sense-assaulting presentation. John is absolutely overwhelmed, and we would have been as well. And then in verse 1, I saw when the Lamb broke one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying as with a voice of thunder, "Come." I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. I have no doubt that this is Jesus. Verse 3, when he broke the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature saying, "Come." And another, a red horse, went out, and to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth, that men should slay one another. And a great sword was given to him. Well, clearly this is warfare. War is coming because a great conquering hero king who's now been crowned is going to unleash it, is going to lead it, is responsible for it, and is directing it. In verse 5, when he broke the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature saying, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. I heard as it were a voice in the center of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." So we talked about this last week. We're going to do a fair amount more of it here this evening. This clearly represents famine. This are the prices for 2 of the commodities, the wheat and the barley, that are extremely excessive. They must be exceptionally rare. People are desperate for the sustenance, for the life-giving sustenance of those commodities. But don't harm the oil or the wine in verse 6. And that's so strange. If our famine here is the result of drought, well, when you have a drought, does that mean that only certain plants get affected and others do not? Or don't they all perish because there's no water? It's not selective. So how can this be? It doesn't make any sense. If you have a famine because of insects, so a plague of locusts comes through, do they only eat one type of green vegetation, not the other? It isn't adding up. And of course, we saw last week, and I want to read the larger part of one of the passages I read last week about this famine to show the specificity of the symbols' reality when it comes to pass shortly in the real world, the material universe of the people that are reading this book, and particularly of the people who are the center of this book, who aren't in Asia, of course, but are in Jerusalem, as we've discussed at other times. And then finally, we have death. When he broke verse 7, the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature saying, "Come." And I looked, and behold, an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him, and authority was given to them over 1/4 of the earth. I understand earth. We've talked about this before. We'll have occasion to do it again. The Greek word geis as referring to the land of Palestine as it is specifically being used, land of Israel, land of Naphtali. Better by far to translate it land, I think, in these contexts than it is earth, which makes us think of the planet. So we have a narrowly focused, escapable judgment that falls upon evil people perfectly paralleling what we had in all of our earlier introductory classes, 5 lessons on Matthew 24 just as a part of it. So we have everything lining up so very perfectly as it was foretold. What else would you expect but lining up perfectly when you have divine authors and power? Now it says in verse, let me stop right there. To kill with sword, with famine, pestilence, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Death is the natural result of any conquering heroes unleashing war, which just inevitably results in famine. And of course, people then die from the warfare and the famine. It is a picture of some awful, terrible war that is soon, a matter of a couple of years, to come upon the earth. Now, I mentioned, and I think I gave 2 reasons last week, why it is that I think at this point, though, that 3 of those horses in the picture before you really represent quite well what I think would have been the appearance of these horsemen, rather than the one on the left, the red horseman, who you can see is really very active and charging ahead and all of that. I don't think that's what happened for 4 reasons. Gave you a couple. Let's talk about all of them here for a minute tonight. Now, what I think I see in this vision, what we're intended to understand in this vision, is the presentation of the threat. There will be a little more tribulation. There's going to be some things that must take place before we have the rest of the book revealed to us. And so these things that are going to take place in this short little while, this time that is near, have the horsemen presenting themselves as a threat, but then being told and waiting for some things to take place before they will be unleashed to ride forth like that red horse is portrayed by this particular author. I think by far, or artist rather, by far the best one I've seen of the numerous ones I have seen. Now, number one, and I introduced you to this thought a little while ago, remember the scroll is what matters. What is written in the scroll is what matters. Seals tell you about who the author is. They tell you about the author's authority. Seals are there for privacy, to ensure that only the right people can read it. Nobody could break the seal except Jesus, and he had to die to be worthy to do it. The Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world is the only one who can read this book and tell us what's in it. So these horsemen, they're just seals. The first 4 seals. They're not the big deal. And so they're just introductory, preparatory. They're going to wreak havoc. It's going to be awful, deadly, but they are instruments of God's indignation. The story of why and the fullness of the how is the scroll, which is this book of Revelation that we're going to be reading it chapter after chapter after chapter. So let's not get too fixated on the 4 horsemen. Everybody knows the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. But remember, they're very limited, really, in their initial presentation as parts of the seal. Or excuse me, as seals, rather than the scroll and its information itself. Okay, then we do have verses 9, 10, and 11 here. Let's read this next. It's the 5th seal. When he broke the 5th seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they'd maintained. And they cried out, again with a loud voice, saying, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" And there was given to each of them a white robe. They were told they should rest for a little while longer, an emphatically little while longer, until their fellow servants and their brethren who were to be killed, even as they had been, should be completed also. So, the reason for the horsemen to ride hasn't been accomplished yet. I take it then that the order hasn't been given for them to ride yet, because we've got this little while. They will be the vengeance, these horsemen, war, famine, death, as the answer to the prayer. They will be the vengeance. They will judge and avenge the blood of those who dwell on the earth, because God sends this coming war to do that very thing. Jesus is leading it. Jesus is coming to wreak this vengeance on behalf of these saints. But it's not yet. It's only a little while longer, and then the horsemen will be unleashed. Number 3, and I think I mentioned this one last week, in chapter 7, in the first 3 verses, after this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, so that no wind should blow on the earth or on the sea or on any tree. That's a lot of the use of the word gace again. And I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, having the seal of the living God, and he cried out with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, "Don't." So notice, this will be important, they are granted the authority and then denied the right to use it. A delay takes place again. So, like the 4 horsemen, we now have these 4 angels at the 4 corners of the earth holding back the 4 winds of the earth. And in verse 3, do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we've sealed the bondservants of our God on their foreheads. Now, I've long wondered about this, and I just don't find any evidence or information, any reason to be able to sort it out and figure it out, I guess. If the sealing of the 144,000 is speaking of the exact same people up here in verse 11, fellow servants and brethren who were to be killed even as they had been should be completed also. They may be the same people. It is obviously the same waiting period, short as it is. It could be that, and I lean toward that depending on the day of the week, I guess. But it also could be just simply people coming to Christ, and so we haven't had the fullness of the generation and effect of the gospel as it goes out, being preached in all the world as a witness to the nations. Again, as we go to the answer to the disciples' question about the when, it's when the gospel's preached in all the ecumeny. So that's Matthew 24 again. So I'm not sure, it's one or the other, but I am sure it's the same time frame. So once again, we have this delay. And you've been granted the authority, but you must not exercise it yet. And that brings us to my 4th reason for thinking again that the writers appear as if to say, you've got one really brief period of time to straighten up, to get your act together, to get ready for this. We need to have a certain number of people die for the gospel still. We need to have this sealing of this 144,000 seal. But when that's over, your time's up. There is delay no longer. So in 6, 4, and 8, likewise with what's just been said in the first 3 verses of chapter 7, the red horse, it says, went out, he appears, he steps forth, him who sat on it, granted to take peace from the earth, and that men should slay one another. And a great sword was given to him. But it doesn't say he wielded the sword. It doesn't say anybody died. It says he was granted the authority to do this. Verse 8 does the same thing. I looked and behold an ashen horse. He who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. And authority was given to them over 1/4 of the earth to kill with sword and with famine and pestilence by the wild beasts of the earth. Well, this time the word is authority. It's been granted. He has it, but he doesn't appear to be doing anything with it yet. So I think that the vision that John is seeing, they present themselves. It's a fearsome thing. You know what they represent. You see what's coming, but we need to delay a little while longer. A couple more things are going to happen. Now, I still want to focus some more You can't overemphasize the importance of this chapter. It is the foundation, the basis, the bedrock. It is the reason why Revelation exists. You got to get chapter 6 right. I don't think very many people do, though it's a sizable number and growing rapidly. If my personal experiences are meaningful, I'm sure they are. I know this idea is catching on because it really makes a lot more sense than the alternatives. So let's talk again about precise fulfillments of prophecies, which therefore is the only reason a prophecy exists, is to prove that the one who utters the prophecy comes from God, is not a liar, a deceiver and a fraud. And we're going to start here with Wars of the Jews, again, Josephus, in book 5 of the Wars of the Jews, chapter 10 of the Wars of the Jews, and paragraph 3 in that book, in that chapter. You can see on the screen there how I've set it up. That's one of 2 standard ways of referencing passages in Josephus. I never could master the other one, so I don't ever use that one. I use this one. But you don't get verse references. The Bible's been broken down even into verses. Thanks to Strong, it's been broken down into words even. But with Josephus, they didn't break it down that far. So you've got books in the Wars of the Jews, volumes. Then you've got chapters, and then you've got paragraphs. So here's just a portion of Wars 5, 10, 3. It was now a miserable case, and a sight that would justly bring tears into our eyes, how men stood as to their food. Now remember, Josephus is in his late 20s. He's been a priest, a Pharisee, and a general fighting against the Romans through in the early part up in Galilee of these 3.5 years. He is now been defeated, and I guess you would describe it as defected. He becomes a ward of Vespasian and Titus, and is their personal historian now, and something of a tool in their hands as well. So Josephus is a wondrous eyewitness presenter of these events. In fact, a few wars in history come to mind, that ancient history, of course, that have as much documentation. So he says, as he watches his own people suffer, it was now a miserable case and a sight that would justly bring tears into our eyes, how men stood as to their food, while the more powerful had more than enough, and the weaker were lamenting for the want of it. But famine was too hard for all other passions, and it is destructive to nothing so much as to modesty. For what was otherwise worthy of reverence was in this case despised, insomuch that children pulled the very morsels that their fathers were eating out of their very mouths. And what was still more to be pitied, so did the mothers do to their infants. And when those that were most dear were perishing under their hands, they were not ashamed to take away from them the very last drops that might preserve their lives. And while they eat after this manner, yet were they not concealed in so doing. But the seditious everywhere came upon them immediately and snatched away from them what they had gotten from others. For when they saw any house shut up, this was to them a signal that the people within had gotten some food. Whereupon they break open the doors and ran in and took pieces of what they were eating almost up out of their very throats, and this by force. The old men who held their food fast were beaten. If the women hid what they had within their hands, their hair was torn for so doing. Nor was there any commiseration shown either to the aged or to the infants, but they lifted up children from the ground as they hung upon the morsels they had gotten, and shook the children down upon the floor. But still they were more barbarously cruel to those that had prevented their coming in, and had actually swallowed down what they were going to seize upon, as if they had been unjustly defrauded of their right. They also invented, and this is very hard to hear, terrible methods of torments to discover where any food was, and they were these: to stop up the passages of the privy parts of the miserable wretches, and to drive sharp stakes up their fundaments. And a man was forced to bear what 'tis terrible even to hear, in order to make him confess that he had but one loaf of bread, or that he might discover a handful of barley meal that was concealed. Josephus is a hostile witness, but he testifies down to the very commodity barley that has been mentioned here in this 6th chapter with regard to the third horseman. And so the specificity, after a while, once you familiarize yourself with Josephus, and particularly Wars of the Jews, although there's a lot of helpful passages in the Antiquities, I've been focusing on Wars for you, just trying to introduce you, get your toes wet, in a massive amount of writing. Let's go on to Book 5, 3 chapters later, chapter 13, and in paragraph 6. There's a guy named John of Gishgala, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, and 2 others that are going to figure highly in our further studies. We'll come back to them, so don't worry about it now. But as for this one of them, 3 Jews that were involved in civil war battles within Jerusalem, while the Romans were assaulting them from outside, they were fighting among themselves inside. So this John is the leader of one of these seditious groups. But as for John, when he could no longer plunder the people, he betook himself to sacrilege and melted down many of the sacred utensils which had been given to the temple, as also many of those vessels which were necessary for such as ministered about holy things, the cauldrons, the dishes, and the tables. Nay, he did not abstain from those pouring vessels that were sent them by Augustus. Augustus Caesar earlier had sent some vessels in honor and respect to the Jews to be used in the temple, and his wife also, it says. For the Roman emperors did ever both honor and adorn this temple, whereas this man, who was a Jew, seized upon what were the donations of foreigners, and said to those that were with him that it was proper for them to use divine things while they were fighting for the divinity without fear, and that such whose warfare is for the temple should live of the temple. His excuse for defiling the temple is what you've just heard. To continue the quote, on which account he emptied the vessels of that sacred wine and oil, this is a small part I read last week, which the priests kept to be poured on the burnt offerings, which lay in the inner court of the temple, and distributed it among the multitude, who in their anointing themselves and drinking used each of them above an hin of them. And here I cannot but speak my mind. This is the part I didn't read. And what the concern I am under dictates to me, and it is this. I suppose, Josephus says, that had the Romans made any longer delay in coming against these villains, that the city would either have been swallowed up by the ground opening upon them, or been overflowed by water, or else been destroyed by such thunder as the country of Sodom perished by. For it had brought forth a generation of men, much more atheistical than were those that suffered such punishments. For by their madness it was that all the people came to be destroyed. Well, here's Josephus as one of them, sounding a lot like Jesus on the Mount of Olives, and prophets in the Old Testament foretelling destructions, not only this one, but others that had predated it in various cities. And so it is because we have a generation of the most wicked Jews imaginable that God is going to annihilate Jewry entirely. Ellen there where it didn't belong. So this whole thing is because time's up. Their iniquity is full. They're going to be demolished, desolate, and not root or branch will be left unto them. Now then, with that said about the famine, let's go ahead and come on over to chapter 6 and its 6th seal. So in verse 12, I looked when he broke the 6th seal, and there was a great earthquake, And the sun became black as sackcloth of hair. The whole moon became like blood. The stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig tree casts its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. The sky, was split apart like a scroll when it's rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. And the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong, every slave and free man, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Now, progressively, we had the first seal and the second seal and the third and the fourth, and they were terrifying. And then I've been reading corroborating evidence about how that war came and those famines took place and the people died because of these things, and those three horsemen did their job. Now we've got this statement where we've gotten even closer, in the sixth, the next to the last of the seals on this scroll is open, and there's just cataclysm that is unleashed. There is earthquake and sun's black and moon's blood and stars of the sky fall to the earth, and fig tree casts its unripe, or like a fig tree, casts unripe figs when shaken by a wind. Sky split apart, mountains and islands moved out of their places. Now, brother, this is a great little kind of test run, I think, in the book of Revelation to get how symbols and signs work. We'll see this one, for instance, when we get to chapter 12 again, how stars can fall to the earth. Well, every star there is vastly larger than Israel to begin with, but than the whole planet Earth, even if you want to go global with that word. It's physically impossible. Stars are not tiny little things dangling like, ornaments on a Christmas tree up in the sky that they could rain down upon the earth. So what the symbols and the signs represent have real world counterparts. But the signs and the symbols themselves do not necessarily, depending on the one we'll talk, take place in a very physical or literal way. So this particular passage, and in fact everything in the last half here of chapter 6, verses 9 through 17, deserves to be read and reread and read again. It is establishing a template for the whole rest of the book. Now, these things we talked about in Daniel, some of them, stars, for instance, representing notable leaders and government figures and powerful individuals in a nation. Daniel uses it that way. There's other passages that use it that way. Joseph, in his vision that got him in so much trouble with his parents and his brothers, used stars in that way back in Genesis. We talked about all these things in the introductory material. So the Jews are familiar with this kind of terminology, and they don't think of it in terms of a planet being destroyed. They think of it in terms of a nation, a city, or a people being destroyed. So let's read it again. When he broke the sixth seal, there was a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth. Well, the literal sun didn't do that. But it's the darkest day you've ever seen. We use that expression to this day, and they just use the expression with a more dramatic and presentation, more descriptive. The sun was blackened like sackcloth. We would say it was a dark day in world history. And then the moon like blood, stars fell, sky split apart. Look especially now at verses 15 through 17. And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the commanders, and the rich, and the strong, and every slave and free man, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. Well, brethren, I think that's literally true. When you have great cataclysms, it's a dark, dark day. A real thing also happens. John F. Kennedy is shot. The two towers will fall. is a dark day. So it's common in our Bibles, Old Testament and New, to have a mixture of the spectacular signs and symbols to give you a feel for how catastrophic all of this is. And then right next to it, people actually doing real things down here on planet Earth, hiding like this. Then it says, more on this in a second, so hold that thought. In 16, they said to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us, hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come. And who's able to stand? Brethren, the great day of their wrath is coming. Shortly after the saints who had been murdered for the gospel of Jesus Christ asked for it. It's the answer to the prayer in verse 10. How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth? A little while longer. In verse 11, the last one of the martyrs hasn't died yet. Then the wrath of the Lamb, the great day of God and Jesus' wrath, their wrath in verse 17, has come. And who's able to stand? Which is exactly the way Malachi said it in chapters 3 and 4 of his prophecy of this same event. Isn't it? We've been to Malachi twice now. He's so important in those last two chapters. But here next, brethren, is a very important string of scriptures I want you to write down. I've got all of them in the margin of my Bible. And if you haven't bought a New American Standard wide margin with 1.5 inch margin, on the sides of each of the pages that face each other, so you can make notes, then go out and buy one. The book of Revelation is the most important book for having marginal references because it uses more Old Testament marginal references than any other book in the whole New Testament. Now let's go back and spend us about 10 minutes over here in Isaiah. So get this list, and to help you out, I'm going to show you all of them right there so you can write them down. But come on down to Isaiah, and we're going to read every one of these passages that you see on the screen now right here. Starting in Isaiah 2, which is, among Christians, one of the best understood and one of the best known and one of the best beloved, if there is such a term, most beloved, of all chapters in Isaiah. We understand Isaiah. We get Isaiah 2. We all agree on Isaiah. It's clear what Isaiah is talking about. When in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, the word which Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem will sound like this in verse 2. It'll come about that in the last days. Now, we worked with Isaiah, I think it was one whole night, as a matter of fact. In the last days. I talked about that a lot, what that phrase means in both the Old and New Testament. The last days, not of the planet at all, but the last days of what in this context? Well, in the last days, the mountain of the house of Yahweh will be established as the chief of the mountains, will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. And many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and he'll judge between the nations and render decisions for many peoples. This is about the coming of Jesus Christ to establish his kingdom in the first century, and there's absolutely no doubt about it. The New Testament, that law will go forth from Jerusalem, which Mount Zion, is underneath. Temple Mount's underneath. This is about the coming of the church, the coming of the kingdom. There's no disagreement, obviously. Of course it is. There isn't any other way you can understand it. And by the way, if you want to make a marginal reference next to verse 3, I've got Micah chapter 4, verse 2. Check it out on your own time. And Luke chapter 24, verses 45 through 47. And then with regard to verse 4, which I'm not even going to read, Isaiah 11, verses 6 through 9, it's all certainly tied together. Saints are not going to learn war anymore, but the gospel's going to go to the Gentiles, and there'll be war everywhere. Just the saints aren't participating in it. That's not a part of their character or their virtue or their instruction. But now, just skip down to verse 11. We've already identified, those are supposed to be commas. They look more like periods, don't they? I guess I got some periods in there by mistake. Little square ones on that beryllium font. Okay, but look, this last days is the first century, and it's the last days of the Mosaic covenant and the first days of Christianity. And now we're coming at the end of that generation to the last days of not just the Mosaic covenant, but the temple and any way to practice the sacrificial parts of that covenant. The last days of the Jews being God's chosen people. That was forever over all those years ago. Now look at verse 11 in chapter 2. The proud look of man will be abased, the loftiness of man will be humbled, and Yahweh alone will be exalted in that day. The same day that is this last day's period of time in chapter 2, verse 2. We're not leaving that first century context when Jesus comes to establish his new law and bring to an end the old one. Look down now, as you can see in verses 17 through 21. The pride of man will be humbled. The loftiness of men will be abased, and Yahweh alone will be exalted in that day. But the idols will completely vanish. Men will go into caves of the rocks and into holes of the ground before the terror of Yahweh and before the splendor of his majesty when he arises to make the earth tremble in that day. Men will cast away to the moles and the bats their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they made for themselves to worship, in order to go into the caverns of the rocks and the clefts of the cliffs before the terror of Yahweh and the splendor of his majesty, when he arises to make the earth tremble. Stop regarding man whose breath is in his nostrils, for why should he be esteemed? In chapter 3, verse 1. Behold, Yahweh, God of hosts. No, that's the Lord Yahweh. God, in this case, is the one that's capitalized to represent the personal name Yahweh. Behold, the Lord Yahweh of hosts is going to remove from Jerusalem and Judah both supply and support, the whole supply of bread and the whole supply of water. Well, brethren, what more are we looking for? It's in the first century days when the gospel establishes a new kingdom, which is the church, to put an end to the old one. It's the last days of the Mosaic covenant. In that day, verse 11, in that day, verse 17, in that day, verse 20, people are going to be saying exactly what we've got in Revelation chapter 6. Because Isaiah and Revelation are talking about the same thing. And every first century Jew would know it. They'd be reading Revelation and go, oh, look at that. He's quoting from Isaiah 2. We're in the last days. Brethren, it was easy for them. It's hard for us because we didn't grow up with the Old Testament. We don't study it near as much as we should. And our unfamiliarity breeds silly ideas like Revelation was written in the 90s. And all it's about is broad strokes of, good will conquer evil eventually. And whenever it tries to get specific, they say, well, it's talking about Rome 400 years from now. It just can't be. It cannot be that because the book says it's shortly to come to pass. So Isaiah says it's all in that day, not 400 years later. No, in that generation, Jesus said. Before you apostles can finish preaching in every city in Israel, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10. Now, skipping ahead to chapter 4, verses 1 through 6, what day are we in? We're 3 chapters deep into Revelation. What's the time frame? In verse 1, 7 women in chapter 4 will take hold of one man in that day, saying, we'll eat our own bread and wear our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our reproach. In that day, the branch of Yahweh will be beautiful and glorious. And the fruit of the earth will be the pride and the adornment of what? Of the survivors of Israel. In Matthew 24, which would take place in that generation, Jesus said to those people, when you see the abomination of desolation, which Luke 21 tells us is Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee. Run to the Judean hills. Hope it's not the winter. Hope you're not pregnant. Flee. It's escapable. If you want to survive in the last days of the Mosaic law, then you run out of Jerusalem when you see it surrounded by armies. Much more to come on that. Verse 3, it'll come about, he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem, called survivors in the preceding verse, will be called holy. Everyone who's recorded for life in Jerusalem. Every faithful saint. The ones that took Jesus' advice and got out of Dodge when the abomination of desolation came. Verse 4, when Yahweh has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and purged the bloodshed of Jerusalem from her midst, which is the prayer of the saints under that altar in Revelation 6, by the spirit of judgment and the spirit of burning, verse 5, then Yahweh will create over the whole area of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day, even smoke, brightness of flaming fire by night, for over all the glory will be a canopy, and there will be a shelter to give shade from the heat by day, refuge and protection from the storm and rain. Imagery familiar to Jews we'll talk about again later that isn't about going to heaven. It's about living on the earth and serving your God. Now, let's skip to chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, or just keep reading. Let me sing now for my well-beloved, not all those that got slain because they were guilty of bloodshed. Verse 1, let me sing now for my well-beloved, a song of my beloved concerning his vineyard. That's Jesus then and the saints. He dug it all around, removed its stones, planted it with the choicest vine. He built a tower in the middle of it. Well, this is kind of sounding like a parable, isn't it? Yeah. He dug it all around, removed its stones, planted it with the choicest vine. He built a tower in the middle of it, hewed out a wine vat in it. Then he expected it to produce good grapes, but it produced only worthless ones. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem, these parables of Jesus often enough get interpreted in the Old Testament for us. Now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I've not done in it? Why then, when I expected it to produce good grapes, did it produce worthless ones? So now let me tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. And I will break down its wall, and it will become trampled ground. And I will lay it waste. It will not be pruned or hoed. But briars and thorns will come up. I'll also charge the clouds to rain no rain on it. Again, symbology I can't get into now, but I think you get it. And now I'm going to close Isaiah with chapter 5, verses 24 through 30. Therefore, as a tongue of fire consumes stubble and dry grass collapses into the flame, so their root, Malachi's neither root nor branch, so their root will become like rot, and their blossom blow away as dust. For they have rejected the law of Yahweh of hosts, and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. On this account, the anger of Yahweh has burned against such people, and he has stretched out his hand against them and struck them down. And the mountains quaked, and their corpses lay like refuse in the middle of the streets. For all this, his anger is not spent, but his hand is still stretched out. He will also lift up a standard to the distant nation, and will whistle for it from the ends of the earth. Behold, it will come with speed swiftly. No one in it is weary or stumbles, none slumbers or sleeps, nor is the belt at his waist undone, nor its sandal strap broken. Its arrows are sharp and all its bows are bent. The hoofs of its horses seem like flint, and its chariot wheels like a whirlwind. Its roaring is like a lioness, and it roars like young lions. It growls as it seizes the prey, and it carries it off with no one to deliver, and it'll growl over it 400 years after Jerusalem falls in 70 AD on Rome. Oh, really? Give me a break. We're still in the first century day, aren't we? It shall growl over it in that day, like the roaring of the sea. If one looks to the land, behold, there's darkness and distress. Even the light is darkened by its clouds, and every Jew gets it. Jerusalem is going down after we get the new law, and we've just had 5 chapters to tell us about it. Wow. Now, brethren, if you've been thinking this is the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC, true enough, the Assyrians did that. True enough, that was also prophesied, and by Isaiah, elsewhere, but not here. Here, in 5 chapters, we are repeatedly told we are still in the last days when Christ establishes his kingdom, which is the church. And the end of that is the fall of Jerusalem. These 5 chapters are not about the end of the world, and they're not about the Assyrian invasion in 722 either. They're about the days Jesus prophesied in Matthew chapter 24. Now, let me wrap this up tonight. I've really got a whole lot more material. My time's expired, as it always does. You know, I've never really turned myself loose. And I do believe I could probably pull 3 to 4 hours. I have with individuals on more than one occasion where we just sit in the living room. You know, I've done these 3 and 4 hour sessions. Brethren, it's marvelous. It's wonderful, the Word of God, when you finally get what it's saying. It's just grand. And here, it's certainly a finale on Jerusalem, the temple, the Jews, and Moses' law. And Hosea was prophesying the same thing. Now, by the way, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah. The memory trick is to clear your throat with an I instead of an E. Ahim. Ahim. A-H-I-M. Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, all prophesied at the same time and of the same things. Look at Hosea 10, verses 5 through 8 now. Contemporary. They may have shaken hands, Hosea and Isaiah. Just imagine. They probably did. And here's Hosea saying this in chapter 10, verses 5 through 8. This time it's about Samaria. The inhabitants of Samaria will fear. For the calf of Bethaven, that means a house of vanity, Bethaven. Indeed, its people will mourn for it, and its idolatrous priests will cry out over it, and its glory, since it has departed from it. The thing itself will be carried to Assyria as tribute to King Jareb. Ephraim will be seized with shame. Israel will be ashamed of its own counsel. Samaria, and by the way, all 3 of those are names for the northern kingdom. So Ephraim and Israel at the end of verse 6, and Samaria at the start of verse 7, are the 3 different terms that mean the 10 tribes in the north. 7. Samaria will be cut off with her king, like a stick on the surface of the water. Also, the high places of Avon, the sin of Israel, will be destroyed. Thorn and thistle will grow on their altars, literally. They will say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. Oh, will they really? So, brethren, if the context in Isaiah 2 and then in 3, 4, 5 tells us that it's in the last days that these things are going to happen and names Jerusalem, then these figures represent what will physically happen on Jerusalem in those days. But when Hosea talks about the same terminology and says it's Samaria, you can believe him too, that it's not terminology about the end of the world. It's about the end of a people, a nation, a society, a kingdom, a city. But not the world. That's just not the way God uses this terminology in the Bible. Now, what should I do? It's exactly 8 o'clock. All right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to just say to you, and we'll probably not go back over this next week, though I have a right to change my mind, even as if God says, I'm going to tell you about things shortly to come to pass, he has a right later to give you 18 verses that talk about something else. I'm going to do it here tonight, and I think I learned that privilege from God himself. I'm going to give you what I think is even more specifically what is being talked about in the sixth seal. We've got a little while to wait before the horses will ride. I think the depredations of Gessius Florus, who was procurator of Judea in 64 to 66 AD, is probably what all the upheaval is that this is talking about, because it was his actions that so provoked the Jews, and it was actually his intention to do so, as I'm sure you'll now read. I'm giving you the assignment instead of reading it here tonight. He wanted to start the war, and he succeeded to cover his own crimes. This guy it kicked off the rebellion that resulted in Nero commanding Vespasian to go and besiege Jerusalem, which ultimately resulted in Titus, Vespasian's son, taking over when Vespasian goes back to become emperor, and Titus then will finish what Jesus prophesied. This guy, Gessius Florus, this Roman procurator, he's the guy that really made it all happen, and I suspect that that's what is very specifically being talked about. He's the guy that's doing what you read about during this short delay now when the last of the saints are being martyred. In Wars, chapter 2, in Wars, I said that wrong. It's book 2, chapter 14, and then in paragraphs 2, 3, and 9. Okay? Too soon. Go read that. Go read Wars of the Jews. Now, all you got to do is go up on whatever search engine you use, and you type in Josephus Wars. You probably don't even need to put Josephus Wars of the Jews. And then there's a website that starts with Penelope, and there's another one, I forget what it starts with, but you'll get the University of Chicago, and probably a dozen other websites that have posted it all for you for free. Now, it's harder to read because it's from the 1700s translation, 1770s I think it was, of William Whiston. So it's Old English. It's harder to read. But they're all available in public domain. Please buy the book by Galia Kornfeld, and it'll be much easier to understand and read because it's a modern translation. But, go read that. That's your assignment for this week. It's on the net. It's easy to find. Wars, book 2, chapter 14, paragraphs 2, 3, and 9. Find out how bad that guy was, what kicked off the war, and how it is then that he got the ball rolling to fulfill everything that Jesus had said. Now, I'm going to close tonight with Luke. It's a fairly long passage, but let's go to Luke 21. We've read this before. I just want you to see how much comes together now that Jesus had prophesied 35 years before this book was written, that you'll hear the echoes of in Revelation, and particularly in chapter 6. So the deeper we get in Revelation, the more all those introductory passages, dozens of them that we studied, 19 weeks, are going to now start coming back to you. So many connections will be made between the Old Testament and the New. No other book in the whole Bible speaks of, the New Testament rather, speaks of the Old Testament like Revelation does. So let's read Luke 21. It's the Lucan account of Matthew's chapters 23, 24, and 25. Both gospel writers are speaking of the identical same event. Here's how Luke puts it in the last part of his discussion. Luke 21, starting in verse 20 and going to the 32nd verse. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize her desolation is at hand. That's Matthew 24:15. 21, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of the city depart. Let not those who are in the country enter the city. That's Matthew 24, verses 16 through 18. And the survivors, those that remain in those days of Isaiah, who we read about tonight in 22. Because these are days of vengeance, in answer to the prayer of the saints underneath the altar, those first century martyrs in the fifth seal, in order that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Old Testament and New, all things that are written about that vengeance. In 23, woe to those who are with child, to those who nurse babes in those days. There will be great distress upon the geese, not the planet. There'll be people living here after this is over. It's not the end of the world. And wrath to this people. That's Matthew 24:19. In verse 24, they'll fall by the edge of the sword, will be led captive into all the nations, Gentile nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot, a phrase we read tonight, by the Gentiles, the word nations, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. 42 months, 1,260 days. We can read about that. And there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, just like they were used in the Old Testament. And upon the earth, dismay among nations, and perplexity at the roaring of the sea and the waves, men fainting from fear, the expectation of the things which are coming upon the world. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to take place, straighten up, lift up your heads, because your redemption, your physical redemption, you want to be one of those that's left. You want to be one that's saved. You want to be one of those survivors of Isaiah. And it's now drawing near. He told them a parable. Behold, the fig tree, all the trees, as soon as they put forth leaves, you see it. Know for yourselves, summer's now near. Even so, you too, when you see these things happening, recognize that the kingdom of God is near. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Yeah, sure enough. Now let me close with one more thought, if I can find it. This too is from one of my students this week. It really took the top of my head off. It was such a great comment. And I hadn't put this particular passage together recently. I hadn't seen it before. I'd long since forgotten about it. Didn't take the time in my introductory lessons. Now's the perfect time. He was reading ahead and put it together himself. We're having so much fun, aren't we? And the best is yet to come. Stick with me, baby. It should get interesting right about now, Bobby Dylan said. Okay? So read this passage now in light of everything we read. Come over here to Luke chapter 23. In verse 27, Jesus is on his way to Calvary, to Golgotha. He is going there. 27, there were following him a great multitude of the people and of women who were mourning and lamenting him, as was prophesied and we've read in several passages. 28, but Jesus turned to them and said, daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Now, brethren, I don't know how to read this expressively. The way I just read it, I think, is so wrong. It's not right. It's not portraying it. I haven't been scourged. I'm not weak beyond telling because of the massive blood loss. I'm not wearing a crown of thorns. So I don't, it's going to take somebody with tremendous acting skills to read this the way it deserves. But in 28, Jesus turning to them said, daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves, for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things in the green tree, what will happen in the dry? 35 to 40 years from now. They're in the green tree now. The bridegroom is with them. This passage, I just got this off the top of my head. We've studied it before. But brethren, write this down and go back to Isaiah 61, the first couple of verses, and then read the fulfillment of it in Luke 4 again. The green tree are those good days in the first part of Isaiah 61, and that's why Jesus closed the book in Luke 4 at the beginning of his ministry, in the beginning of the 40 years probation period, at the beginning of that generation. Jesus didn't close the book and didn't read about the vengeance that immediately follows as the sentence continues in Isaiah 61. So many connections if you're familiar with your Old Testament. And Josephus, get to know him too.